Good morning. Good to see you.
Well, it'll be good to see you too when I can see you. Here you are.
Good morning, Rose. I like your art, Rose. Are you an artist? You're muted.
No, I'm not an artist, and actually, those were sewn by some people in, I believe it was either Korea or one of the other Asian countries.
So those are photographs of tapestry?
No, they're originals.
Those are original tapestries?
Yes.
Wow, detailed for so small.
Sorry you can't see more of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I think we're about ready to roll. You're back, Sylvia. And okay. When we left off, we were dealing with examples of the mystical impulse in Jewish prayers. One of the most overtly Kabbalistic prayers that we have, because it was composed by a Kabbalist, is the song Lecha Dodi. Okay? Lecha Dodi, actually there's been a whole book written on the Kabbalistic ideas contained in this song. And I'm only going to give you a very small portion of that today. The book would take a lot longer than an hour. They're in the process of translating the book into English. So hopefully one day you'll be able to get the entire thing. But, Lecha Dodi, even though it was only written in the 16th century, it very quickly became the centerpiece of Kabbalat Shabbat throughout the Jewish world. Now, even in the time of the Talmud, Shabbat was greeted as a bride, as a queen. And so it seemed logical to include something about that, some kind of greeting for the bride, for the queen, at the moment of transition from the weekday to the Shabbat, from ordinary time to holy time. Okay? What's that transition in Kabbalat Shabbat? Well, you have the 6 Psalms that represent the 6 days of creation. And then you have the Sabbath Psalm that represents Sabbath. And Lecha Dodi is the bridge between those two. You should also know, if you know Lecha Dodi, you know that it has 9 stanzas. So if you include the refrain, that's 10. Right? You have a parallel to the 10 Sfirot. And you can say, oh, well, that's nice. That's coincidental, isn't it? Except it's not coincidental from the point of view of the author. The author intended that and all sorts of other things to represent certain Kabbalistic ideas. And the refrain gives life to the entire composition, right? Just as the first Sfirah, Keter, gives life to everything below it. Okay? You also have 6 stanzas that deal with Jerusalem in the middle. and those represent the 6 sfirot around Tiferet. The word Tiferet is one of the sfirot. The word Tiferet means beauty. What greater beauty is there than Jerusalem? Right? And we're not talking about physical beauty. Back in those days, Jerusalem was pretty decrepit physically, but spiritually, it was the place where you went to meet God. And certainly in ancient times when the temple existed, that's where you had the most spiritual experience possible. So there are all sorts of things in Lecha Dodi that connect to Kabbalistic ideas. By the way, Shlomo Alkabetz, the author, included his name as an acrostic in the opening letters of the first 8 stanzas of this song. And he has an awful lot more. If you could have, and I'm sorry I couldn't do this for you very easily, the Hebrew words, Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Pnei Shabbat Nekabla. That's the refrain, right? So if you would look at the Hebrew letters in this, and I encourage you to look this up in your Siddur afterwards, right? That refrain has 26 letters, right? 15 in the first 2 words, and or rather in the first half of that verse, and 11 letters in the last part of the verse. 15 and 11, which makes 26. 26 is a parallel to the numerical value of the Yud He Vav He, the name of God. Right? Yud is 10, He is 5, Vav is 6, He is 5. Right? Not only is it a parallel in the total, but it's a parallel to this line in the Hebrew, because Yud He is 15 and Vav He is 11. So, I mean, you can claim that's just coincidence, but you're talking about a world-class Kabbalist. Don't tell me that he didn't know exactly what he was doing when he composed this. The verse on which the refrain is based comes from Song of Songs. Come, my beloved, let us go into the field. Right? Now, in the original Song of Songs, that's about the love of an earthly bride and groom. But, the rabbis didn't interpret Song of Songs that way. It was the love of God and Israel. And so there's this corresponding union that exists on a higher level. Right? The word Dodi is interesting. Right? Lecha Dodi. Dodi means my beloved, but it's also code language for God, because if you reverse its letters, you have Yud Daled Vav Daled. Daled and He are both used as abbreviations for the name of God, and so they can be seen as interchangeable. So Dodi is also a kind of a version of the 4-letter name of God, right? And it is also the name that is applied to the Sphira of Tiferet, the masculine principle in the Sphirot, right? That's just, kind of a short introduction to this song, right? I want to show you in verse 8. This verse says, break out of your confines to the left and the right. What's he talking about with the left and the right? Well, there's a teaching in the Talmud that says God offered the Torah to all the nations before he revealed it to Israel. The Zohar adapted that theme, and Alphabets had to have been familiar with this, applied it to the children of Esau and Ishmael. Right? The children of Esau, well, that's Christianity. Ishmael is Islam, right? The Arab nation. So the presumption here is that the Torah was offered to those communities before it was accepted by Israel, right? And they, so they don't have as elevated a role in the cosmos as Judaism does. Now think of where their Sabbath is. The Sabbath of Islam is on what day? Friday.
Friday.
The Sabbath of Christianity, of course, is on Sunday. So they are to the right and the left of Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, right? So this is a prayer that, the holiness of Shabbat is going to extend right and left, but it's also a message about Islam and Christianity, that when the Messiah comes, Messiah is Ben Peretz, the son of Peretz, right? Peretz is one of the ancestors of King David. And we all know that the Messiah is going to come from the house of David, right? So this is code language for, the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, the people on the right and the left will get the message. They will acknowledge that Judaism is the true religion, and they will ascend to the higher level of the Torah, and that will bring joy and rejoicing in fullness of days. Okay? And by the way, Peretz is 10 generations before King David. So that suggests to the Kabbalists that the ultimate redemption flows through all the 10 Sfirot, right? So, there's all this code language included in Lecha Dodi, and it's, there is much, much more that we don't have time to cover here. But when the book comes out in English, you can read the whole thing. It's a very, very intricate Kabbalistic piece. And of course, most of us, when we sing Lecha Dodi at services, and, we use all these lovely melodies for Lecha Dodi, and most of us really have no idea that, this is the encoded message within it. Yes, Daniel.
That's exactly what you just said goes directly to my question. When a writer of literature includes symbols and metaphors and historical references and so on and so forth, that writer is playing. They're enjoying the creative process, and they're sending multiple messages. Do you think the writer of this was thinking that everybody was going to understand this? Or was he doing it for his own creative enjoyment? I mean, why did he put
I
things in there?
That he didn't do it for creative enjoyment. He did it because it was meaningful to him, and it would be meaningful to those who were part of his Kabbalistic circles.
But not the general, not their general public.
No, I don't know that he envisioned that, the average non-Kabbalistic Jew would ever recite this.
Okay, the light just went on. All right. Okay, I get it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Lou.
I have a lot, so cut me off whenever you feel it's appropriate. Going back to the Psalms before Lecha Dodi and then Lecha Dodi and the Psalms after. After Lecha Dodi is Psalm 92, which isn't that Psalm for Shabbat?
Yes.
And then following that is Psalm 93.
Yes.
Which is the Psalm for Friday, I think, right?
When used on Friday morning, yes, it's a psalm, but it represents something different here.
Well, I was wondering why the Psalm for Shabbat wasn't the last Psalm in Kabbalat Shabbat.
Because, you know, there's always a day of redemption that goes beyond our normal experience in the 7 days of the week. And so, you know, there's always that which we hope for, which is the day of redemption that goes, you know, beyond all our normal possibilities. That's why an 8th Psalm is added
there. Okay, the concept of using both Hey and Daled.
Yes, as abbreviations for the 4-letter name.
That's new to me, and I'm glad that something new to me.
So you know about Hey being used.
I know about Hey. I never heard about the Daled, and I wonder if that's just a type of gematria game.
No. Here's why it happened. Because, you know, we use the word Hashem to talk about God. Why is that? Because the actual name, the 4-letter name, is too holy to use, right? And so there are some people who won't even say the word Hashem. They will say Adoshem or something like that. So there were people who said, well, Hey, even though it's an abbreviation for the 4-letter name of God, that's too holy. Let's use Daled instead. And everybody will know what we're talking about. That's why Daled as well as Hey.
I don't think everybody knows it.
Maybe not. That's fine. So now you know.
And I'd just like to point out there's also 10 generations from Adam to Noach and 10 from Noach to Abraham.
Yes.
Why was Peretz picked and not as Ben Peretz as opposed to Ben Yehuda or Ben David?
Maybe for poetic purposes, but he is 10 generations before David. So I assume that it has to do with the 10 Sfirot.
In your book, you mentioned 4 dimensions in one of the stanzas.
Yeah, I didn't want to get into that here today. I just, you know, you can read it and you can ask me about that another time.
Yeah, I'll have to because I don't understand that one, but I don't see that. But another time. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That's it for now.
Okay. Anyone else have a question or a comment here? All right, let's go to text number 10. And here we have the ritual for Sukkot, which I assume that all of you have heard of, at least, if you haven't actually done it in your Sukkah. The ritual, it's called Ushpizin, right? So this developed in Kabbalistic circles. And when you look at the list here, right? Look at the list of the guests who are invited for the 7 days of Sukkot. What is wrong in this list? Yes, Lou.
Sorry, but I have a cheat sheet. It's called a Kabbalah.
You read the book.
Reader. I'm reading. I'm staying current. I don't want to get too far ahead. But it's that they're out of order.
And what is out of order?
Joseph and Moses. And
right.
Aaron.
Right. The Joseph chronologically comes after Jacob, not and before Moses. Why do they have him for day 6 instead of day 4? So Lou has the cheat sheet, which tells you exactly why Joseph is moved to number 6. Because these 7 shepherds who we invite to our sukkah correspond to the lower 7 sfirot. Okay? The next to last of the 7 sfirot is Yesod. And Yesod means foundation, but it in the body of the divine that it represents, it refers to the sexual organs. Well, Joseph is held up in Jewish tradition as the model of one who resisted temptation sexually, right? When Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, right? Joseph controls himself, controls his impulses, right? So he's associated with Yesod, and therefore he is moved out of his chronological proper place and moved down to the 6th day to correspond to the Sphira of Yesod. Now, not every version of the Ushpizin is arranged this way, but that was the order followed by Isaac Luria. It's the one that's followed in the Sephardi liturgy. It's the one that Hasidim follow today. And it's not the only Kabbalistic practice in connection with Sukkot as well. All right. So it's just one of those little Kabbalistic influences in Jewish ritual. Okay. Any questions? All right, then, let's look at number 11. Okay. Now, this is about the ritual that takes place on the evening of Shavuot. It was customary for people to stay up late on Shavuot and then to have Shachrit at the earliest possible time. Why? Because Shavuot is the reenactment of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, right? And the Torah reading for that morning is, in fact, the reading from Exodus 20, the giving of the 10 Commandments, right? And Exodus 19, of course, the leading up to the moment of revelation. So this Kabbalistic practice developed that we would stay up all night long, study Torah. There are actual books that contain recommended portions from every aspect of Jewish Torah literature. So you get a little sampling of everything to work through during the night. And then, at the first dawn, that's when you have the morning service, right? So, this ritual may even be earlier than Kabbalah. It might go back to the Hechalot mystics in the early centuries of the Common Era, but almost certainly existed in the time of the Zohar in the 13th century. So here is a prayer that was written before study at the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Okay? May it be your will, Lord our God and God of our fathers, that our learning of what we will study tonight will bring you satisfaction. Remember, it's not about what it does for us, it's about what it does for God. And it will bring us satisfaction and strength so that we might continue setting the crown on the head of Zeir. Right? Who is Zeir? Right? So that's, the masculine force within the Sfirot. Right? And to make 24 adornments for the Shekhinah, for the feminine within the Sfirot, corresponding to the 24 books of the Bible, which correspond to the 24 permutations of your great name. In other words, if you take the different letters of the name of God, you can make 24 different permutations of them. Right? So in the 16th century, this ritual of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot becomes very, very important. Alkabetz, by the way, the author of Lecha Dodi, says that, it existed in the Balkan communities, even before they came to Tzvat. He was a native of Salonika, which became a really very powerful Jewish community especially after the arrival of people escaping from the Iberian Peninsula after 1492. This text is based on the practice of Rabbi Isaiah Horwitz, who we've come across a few times. The purpose of the study session is it's not just to kind of connect with Sinai, but it's a replication of the coronation of God and the union of Zeir, Tiferet, and Shekhinah, the masculine and the feminine within the Sfirot. So these are a few examples of different Kabbalistic customs that came into Jewish ritual and prayer. Just to give you one more here, this is a text about Shabbat, which you can actually find in the previous edition of Sim Shalom, the Sabbath and Festival Prayer Book. Okay? The one that we use in the chapel, and the edition before that, which was the big Sim Shalom, you'll find this text in there. All right? So here's what it says. It's called Raza de Shabbat, the mystery of Shabbat. She is Shabbat as she unifies with the mysterious one, causing that one to settle upon her. Prayer for the entrance of Shabbat for the precious holy throne is united in mystery of one, arrayed for the supernal holy king to rest upon her. When Sabbath enters, she unites and separates from the Sitra Achra, the other side, the evil side. Right? All evil forces of judgment are removed from her. She dwells in union with the holy light, adorned with many crowns for the holy king. All powers of wrath and masters of judgment flee. No other power reigns in all the worlds. Her face shines with supernal radiance as she is crowned from below by the holy people, all of whom are adorned with new souls. Then, beginning prayer, blessing her with joy and beaming faces, saying, Baruch Hu et Hashem, but Dafka et Hashem, to open by addressing her with blessings. So in this Sfirot, in the upper realm, in the cosmos, every holy day has its function. So there are 6 days that are mentioned in the Zohar in the preceding segment, deals with those 6 special days to parallel the 6 Sfirot before Shechina, the last of the Sfirot. The mystery of Shabbat that is referred to at the beginning here is Shabbat is that special Sfirah, Shechina. That is Shabbat. And, Shabbat is the time of the unification of the Sfirot, the marriage of Tiferet and Shekhinah taking place in the higher realms. So what happens at that moment when we move from weekday to Shabbat? So, now the Shekhinah is protected. It's protected from all the terrible things, the bad things that can happen because they come from the bad side. All right, the other side of the Sfirot, the demonic side. All right, the demons can come get you during the week, but not on Shabbat. Okay, I think we talked about the fact that on Shabbat you have a neshama yetera, an extra soul. Right? That's an old rabbinic notion. Kabbalists didn't come up with that. But the Kabbalists understand it to say that because of this extra soul, you're able to go higher in the Sfirot and bring Shekhinah up to her partner to connect Tiferet from above and Shekhinah from below. And that's what makes the cosmos go round, right? So that's the function of this passage, and that's why it became common to include it in the prayers that were recited when we finished Kabbalat Shabbat and began the Mariv service. Yes, Daniel.
When I read the English, I get a very strong and clear tone of a romantic cleaving, a romantic union. Was that intended, or is that just something I'm reading into the English?
Yes, it's absolutely intended. And in Kabbalah in general, when they talk about the union of Tiferet and Shekhinah, the male and feminine principles in the Sfirot, at least they are the primary symbols for male and female. They talk about it as zivug, as mating. That's pretty direct. If you pin a Kabbalist to the wall, they will tell you that it's not a physical thing, but they sure talk about it as if it were.
Well, this says the mystery is that she is Sabbath as she unifies with the
mysterious
one, causing that one to settle upon her. I mean,
yeah.
That can't be my.
Yeah, that's pretty direct, isn't it? Yeah. So they definitely talk about it in the language of mating. Right? The Sefirot may not be physical, but they sure sound like it.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Other comments or questions here? Yes, Lou.
The Omer has a Kabbalistic connection in counting the Omer.
Yes.
All right. What about Hanukkah and Purim?
You know, there are some things that associate with Hanukkah. I'm not aware of any, you know, particular Purim customs that are Kabbalistic, but that's just, you know, that's probably my own fault and not that they don't exist. None of them play a major role in Hanukkah. So that's why I didn't really want to, you know, go into any of that. Okay. Any other questions, anyone? Okay. So let's begin our next unit, which has to do with Hasidism. And it's a natural thing to go from, you know, Kabbalah in ritual and prayer to go to Hasidism, because the people today who are most likely to include these kinds of rituals are the Hasidim. They may not have thought of them in ways that were as intricate as the Kabbalists in Tzfat did. I mean, I'm almost tempted to use the language, well, let's not say dumbing things down. They tended to simplify Kabbalah for the masses. So that's where all this mystical material became practiced. So why did it come into being in Eastern Europe? There have been many reasons suggested by historians for the development of Hasidism. Very often, historians tend to think of new developments as reactions to upheaval, as reactions to bad things that happened in Jewish life. So, you know, we had the Cossack massacres in 1648, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed in the Ukraine. Right? You had in around 1666 the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi we talked about earlier. You had a wave of blood libels in Poland in the early 18th century. Probably those are a small part of why Hasidism came into being. The real problem was that the road to a meaningful life in Judaism was not open to that many people. If you wanted to be somebody in the 18th century in Judaism, there were two roads open to you. One of them was you could make a fortune. Obviously, you know, only a few people are going to be able to accomplish that, but it could be done, right? You become rich, you know, and you know, it's just like, you know, Tevye says, when you're rich, they think you really know. Okay? The other way is you become a Torah scholar. You spend years and years and years, you write books, you write commentaries on more and more intricate and arcane issues within Judaism, things that very few people really care about, but they are, you know, it's like academia today. You can be a scholar in some pretty tiny areas of scholarship, right? Your books might be read and understood by 40 or 50 people in the world, but it gets you tenure, right? And so, fine, right? But unfortunately, only a small number of people can attain that level. There are only so many rabbis that a community can support. So if you're not going to be rich and you're not going to be one of these learned rabbis, you're going to have to, struggle for a living like everybody else. And it's not just that you struggle for a living. Even more than that, it's like you don't really matter. Those people matter. But you and I, the average people in the Jewish community, we don't matter. And so do we matter to God? Hasidism was the movement that came along and said, yes, you matter to God. And yeah, we should all study Torah. And, yeah, we all need to make a living. But rich or poor, learned or unlearned, God loves you. God cares about you. God wants you to celebrate your Judaism in joy. And you should, and God loves your service. And God loves you. Right? There were Hasidic-like circles even before the 18th century when this, developed into a movement. And Kabbalistic teachings existed within some of those circles. But the first center of Hasidism as a movement develops in a little city in Poland called Mezhibaj. And it used to be thought that, one of the reasons why Hasidism developed was because so many of the Jews were poor, right? Well, Mezhibaj, it happens that they found the tax records from those cities. Scholars have gone through those tax records, and what they found was that most of the Jews were middle class. They were not rich, but they were doing okay. They were making the same kind of living that, and working hard for it, but probably the same kind of living that our parents and grandparents made as they made it into the middle class. And so Hasidism wasn't built out of the despair of poverty. It was built on the idea that your life had meaning, right? Much in the same way that, many Jews rejected the Judaism of their parents in the 60s and 70s, the kind of the inherited, this is, how we were raised, and this is how we do Judaism, and we go to synagogue once in a while, and you're going to study for your bar mitzvah. And people rejected that, and either they walked away, or they found some other spiritual path, or they walked into a neo-Hasidic path, finding part of the spiritual beauty of Judaism. There were those who took that path as well. Okay? And so, there are those who predicted that Hasidism would never make it in the modern world. Why? Because Hasidism came about in a time when when the Jews were poor, and it gave meaning to the life of those who were poor. Well, in the modern world, most, the next generation of Jews, they all made it up at least to the middle class, right? Guess what? Hasidism is thriving today. There are hundreds, and people after the Second World War, when Hasidism was decimated by the Holocaust, people believed that there would be no more Hasidism, that they couldn't exist in modern countries like Israel and the United States, except that that's exactly where Hasidism thrived. They didn't go back to Eastern Europe. What was there to go back to? They founded new communities in this country and in Israel. Right? Hasidism developed around a set of ideas that were taught to a circle of disciples who then spread those ideas to large numbers of Jews in Eastern Europe. And most of those ideas began with one person, the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel, Baal Shem Tov. Okay? Baal Shem, those of you who were in class last hour, we talked about him a little bit. The Baal Shem Tov was a amulet writer, a wonder worker. Okay? Lived from about 1700 to 1760. He, most of the sages of that time, part of their fame rested on who their teacher was. Baal Shem Tov had no famous teacher. He used to tell people that he studied with Achia the Shionite. Right? Well, Achia was a biblical figure. He said, was one of these prophetic figures. So he had no prominent pedigree, right? But his disciples changed the landscape of Eastern European Judaism. And Hasidism becomes this great revivalist movement. We don't know much about the early years of the Baal Shem Tov. There are books that are written long after he died. Most notably, there is a book which in English is called In Praise of the Baal Shem Tov, which is written over 50 years after he died and has a ton of legendary material, which is, probably added to, make him sound more impressive and more of a wonder worker than he really was in his lifetime. Because, adds to the status of the movement. The Baal Shem Tov is learned, but not in the way that rabbis were thought of as learned back then, that they, led a yeshiva or that they wrote books and intricate commentaries on issues that most average people didn't care about. But he wanted his students to connect with God, and he wanted the average Jew to be able to connect with God. There are 4 common denominators among all the Hasidic groups. And as we begin today and go through the next couple of weeks, we will see all 4 of those through different texts. 4 common denominators in Hasidism which can be traced to the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, the Baal Shem Tov himself doesn't actually have a Hasidic court. He teaches certain ideas. The movement of Hasidism doesn't really develop as a movement until the next generation. After he dies, the leadership of this Hasidic circle is taken over by this particular Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezerich, known as the Maggid of Mezerich. And Dov Ber starts sending out rabbis to different places in Eastern Europe and saying, I want you to go establish a Hasidic court in such and such a place. And so hundreds of these Hasidic rabbis teaching the approach of the Baal Shem Tov are contesting the established Jewish community for leadership and for the souls of Jews in there. And it becomes a very attractive set of ideas and practices for the average Jew. So that Judaism becomes less about just keeping Jewish practice, but it's a way of connecting with God. It's a way of exalting and giving joy to the life of the average Jew. And yes, everybody keeps the rules, everybody keeps Shabbat, everybody prays and so on and so forth, but it's a means to the end of serving God with joy and elevating the soul in appreciation of God. So a typical text conveying this is a lengthy story about how the Baal Shem Tov meets Rabbi Dov Ber, who is the eventual successor to the Baal Shem Tov. The story has it, and there are many different versions of the story. This is just the one that I helped translate. So Dov Ber was a rabbi and an extremely learned rabbi at that, but he was not part of the Hasidic crowd. And at a certain point, he hears about this famous rabbi, the Baal Shem Tov, and how people come to him. And through the power of his prayers, the Baal Shem Tov achieves awesome and wonderful things. Okay? He's a bit of a wonder worker. And that sounds pretty strange to Dov Ber. Dov Ber knows the Talmud, the codes, the Kabbalah, knows everything there is to know. And yet he hears about this guy and he says, I'm going to go test him. Right? I'm going to go test the Rebbe. And so, it says he goes, it's a journey of several days. And he's very upset because, normally he studies like 12 hours a day, and he can't do that when he's on the road. When you're sitting there in the carriage, riding along, it's pretty hard to focus on your book for, the whole day. And you can't study at night. Right? So eventually he gets to the Baal Shem Tov. And by now he's sad because he's missed out on his daily regimen of Torah learning. And he thinks that the Baal Shem Tov is going to tell him some Torah. And instead, the Baal Shem Tov tells him a story about how he went on a journey of many days. He had no bread to give to his Gentile coach driver. A poor Gentile came along with a sack of loaves. He was able to buy bread with which to feed his driver. And he told him other tales of this sort. And then the Dov Ber comes and sees him the next day, and the Baal Shem Tov tells him that, another story, he had no fodder to give to his horses, and so on and so forth. All these tales that he related contained hidden, marvelous wisdom, if one could only understand it. But Dov Ber failed to appreciate this and returned to his inn, saying to his servant, I want to go home. That's it. I've had enough. It's dark. We're not going to go tonight. We'll stay, or at least not yet. We're going to wait until there's plenty of light from the moon, and then we're getting out of here. I'm done with waiting for this guy to show me something. And at midnight, he's getting ready to go And the Baal Shem Tov sends his servant to summon him. So he goes. You know, he's not going to be rude. Right? Baal Shem Tov says, "Are you a scholar?" Yeah. And I say, and that's what I heard. And you know the wisdom of the Kabbalah. Dov Ber says, yes. So he says, you know, tells his servant, "Bring me a copy of Eitz Chaim." Baal Shem Tov shows Dov Ber a passage in this book, and Dov Ber looks at it and he expounds it to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says to him, "You have not the slightest degree of understanding in this passage." Okay, Dov Ber, nobody has ever talked to Dov Ber like this before. So he looks at it again. He says to the Baal Shem Tov, "You know, this is how it is. But if your honor knows of another meaning, let him tell it to me and I shall judge which is more correct." So the Baal Shem Tov says, "Arise." Dov Ber gets up. This particular text contained many names of angels. No sooner did the Baal Shem Tov begin to recite the text than the whole house was filled with light and fire burned around it, and they actually saw the angels mentioned in the text. So it becomes a real experience. And he said to Rabbi Dov Ber, "It is true that the meaning of the text was as you stated it to be, but your study of it had no soul in it." And on the spot, Rabbi Dov Ber ordered his servant to journey home, while he himself remained in the home of the Baal Shem Tov, from whom he learned great and deep topics of wisdom. The Chassid heard all this from the holy mouth of Rabbi Dov Ber.
So the Rabbi Dov Ber is essentially the what's the Hebrew word? The people who were opposed. The
He would be, although there's not an organized opposition yet. But yeah, if he had been born a little later, he would have been one of the Misnagdim.
But the story is using him to represent that clinical view that the Baal Shem Tov was against, because the Baal Shem Tov is coming along and calling upon the angels, and it becomes this real emotional experience where you kind of convert the other guy. That's what I'm reading. I'm just asking.
It's a conversion experience, which, I mean, I talk about this in my book, the fact that, you know, what Christians call born again, right? Dov Ber has this kind of experience of being born again. And that was true with many of the people who gathered around the Baal Shem Tov. And he started out as this other kind of rabbi who was very aloof from the average person. You know, he was very devout, but it was all academic, and his piety was just personal. It was not, you know, connected to the average Jew.
It's a great story. Thank you for bringing that to us.
Oh, it's really one of the classic stories of Hasidism. And most of what I share with you about Hasidism is not stories. Mostly it's going to be texts. But, you know, this story also, it really is a text with a lot of interesting stuff in it. You know, one of the other versions of this story suggests that Dov Ber went because he needed healing. He was in poor physical health, and he was hoping that maybe the Baal Shem Tov could give him some relief. Well, it didn't work out that way, but he got something better. He got spiritual health instead of physical health. That's what he got from the Baal Shem Tov.
Healing that gave the Baal to Dov Ber was similar to the healing the Baal Shem Tov brought to the Jewish people.
That's the idea. That's exactly the idea. So another thing that comes out from this story is the idea that behind ordinary looking things like this text that we see in the story, there is great and marvelous wisdom. God is present in everything. Okay? There's a lot more than what we say and what we see explicitly. So if you go back to the second paragraph of that story, it says, when he came the next day, the Baal Shem Tov told him of how on that journey he had no fodder to give to his horses, etc. Okay? So the etc. is very deliberate. It's not just something that I happen to include here. It's part of the original text. It's a very common device in Hasidic stories. And it says, in effect, there's more going on than we can tell you. There's more going on than just what's on the surface of the story. Right? There, if you look behind the etc., there are hidden mysteries to be seen and understood. A third thing from this, many Jews in this period, including those who were made very anxious by the development of Hasidism, seemed to understand that at least there was a snippet of truth within Hasidism. Dov Ber is opposed to it, but he goes to the Baal Shem Tov because he's heard about him, and he just has the sense that maybe there's something in it. And that became true for a lot of people in Eastern Europe. Okay? Other people who were initially very hostile to Hasidism wound up being followers of the Baal Shem Tov, recorded his teachings, and they became his disciples. It's not because the Baal Shem Tov somehow knows more text, knows more Torah than Dov Ber. That's not what's going on here. Strictly speaking, Dov Ber is the real scholar, right? But it has no soul, right? What's more important is the soul that the Baal Shem Tov imbues within his Torah, right? So the Hasidic Rabbi, when he teaches Torah, he infuses it with this, connection with the divine power, right? It's more a singing of the Torah than it is simply teaching a text or even a moral lesson, right? The mystic doesn't just want to learn Torah. The mystic wants to experience God. And Dov Ber suddenly has an experience of God. And that's why he begins to acknowledge the wisdom of the Baal Shem Tov. Yes, Daniel.
So at some point, Hasidim are known for ecstatic, I think that's the right word, experiences, yes. Dancing and singing, and it's almost like a revival in my mind.
Because it's an experience of joy.
Did the Baal Shem Tov initiate that, or was that something they evolved to? When he said an emotional, soulful experience, was he talking about going?
It starts with the Baal Shem Tov.
Okay.
The Baal Shem Tov, although, again, he doesn't really have an organized movement, but he does, have all these ideas and practices that he performs. And so he's the one who emphasizes these things. I'll give you another example. So a lot of the rabbis in that time practiced very ascetic practices, self-denial. They would engage in frequent fasts. They would is stay up late studying Torah and put their feet in buckets of ice water so that it would keep them awake. All right. Sounds pretty crazy, but you know, self-denial is a way of bringing yourself to do more, right? Baal Shem Tov thought that was kind of crazy. He says, you just, you know, if you can just serve God with love, serve God with joy, serve God with song and with dance and with love in your heart for other Jews, that's the way to be close to God. And ecstatic prayer was part of that program. The Baal Shem Tov definitely engages. Again, some of the legends have been embellished, so you can't trust every text you read about the Baal Shem Tov. But clearly the early texts make it clear that, that he's engaged in ecstatic prayer on a very regular basis. And that he sets the tone for his congregation, for his students, for everyone around him. And that takes them into the next generations. Right. We'll talk about how it evolves over the generations as we go. But and again, you know, in the period of Tzfat and Lurianic Kabbalah, Kabbalah was really complicated, and he's not like that at all. This is, you know, it's chunked down so that the average person can figure it out, can experience it, can do it with joy, with ecstasy. Right? And Dov Ber becomes the one who makes this into a movement and sends out other rabbis all across Eastern Europe and says, you go here, you go there, you go over there, you guys establish Hasidic congregations and bring people into them. Attract.
One more very quick question, Rabbi.
Please.
I'm sorry to take us over.
No,
On
fine.
the other side of the mechitza, were women dancing and performing like this, or was that too much for them? Oh, no.
In fact, it's been suggested that in this period, there were no female Hasidim. Right? This is a male phenomenon. It is supported by women, and in some cases, in the early generations of Hasidism, it's women who are financial supporters of Hasidism. But no, the women are not leaders in this respect.
But they aren't having ecstatic experiences either.
No. I'm sorry, I've completely lost track of time. We really have to finish up. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Sorry to take you off.
No problem. Bye-bye.